Welcome back to Principles of Economics with Professor Klein. The topic of today's video is calculating unemployment. Okay. Now, it might seem like calculating unemployment should be relatively straightforward, but because of the way we define things, it can get a little complicated, right? And you might wonder why we have to make such weird definitions, because we have sometimes some really weird data. Okay, so here's what happens. When we start with unemployment as economists, we actually start with the civilian non-institutional population. So what is the civilian non-institutional population, which we will abbreviate CNP? Well, it takes the total population of the United States and then it eliminates, it weeds out, well, civilian, any active military. Right? And then it also eliminates anyone who is institutionalized, right? Such as prisoners. And then it also eliminates persons under 16. Why? Because most laws require that you be 16 by the time you work, depending on the state law. And why do we do this? Because we really want you to go to school and collect the information that way. Now, you might wonder, why are we excluding active military? They have a job, right? Why are we excluding prisoners and such? They might even be working as well. Well, it's because of the nature of what might be their work, right? For instance, if you consider active military, let's say that you are in Afghanistan and you hate the heat and you're tired of the desert, and so you walk to your commanding officer and you simply say, "That's it, I quit," right? The person would laugh at you because you don't just get to quit at the end of the day. So because you aren't able to separate like you can in a typical job, we classify these differently and we don't really feel like it's representative of the overall labor market. All right, so the civilian non-institutional population takes the total population of the United States and eliminates these from our calculation. So you're going to see that we are going to start with a number that is much smaller than the total population of the US. Now, from the civilian non-institutional population, we have two possible states of being. And I'm just going to go ahead and show you the graph that I think helps here, or the diagram, right? And so from the civilian non-institutional population, there are two possible outcomes. You are either in the labor force, and we'll talk about there are two options there, or because we're economists and not English majors, not in the labor force. That's it. So if you're in the civilian non-institutional population, we then classify you as either in the labor force or not in the labor force. We're going to come back to not in the labor force here in just a minute. Labor force, we're going to put you into one of two categories, which also means that labor force is going to be equal to the addition of these two categories, right? So the first one is employed. And employed can be full-time or part-time. And so the way that we get this information, the BLS, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, who also gets some help from the Census Department, they actually do phone calls to 100,000 households every month. And so in that, they call people up and they ask them, did you work for pay in the last week? And so if you answer yes, then you're easy to classify. You are employed, which also means you are part of the labor force and part of the civilian non-institutional population. For the most part, you're done. Now, unemployed, you have to be careful here. It's not just people who don't have a job. Instead, it is people who have actively searched for a job in the last 4 weeks. So within the last month from whenever you're contacted. Now, why is it that you have to have actively searched for a job in the last 4 weeks? Well, let's consider you're unemployed and you're not looking for a job. what are the chances that you're going to get a job offer, right? Very close to zero, unless your uncle who owns a business calls you up and says, hey, I really need your help, right? But overall, it's particularly difficult to get a job if you're not actively looking for one. And so if you're not looking for one, this doesn't give us a really good representation of what's going on in the labor market. Now, we'll come back because there are some people who have given up looking for a job, right? If you've given up looking for a job, you're no longer over here, right? You're now over here. But we do collect information about these people. We call them discouraged workers. So those are people who have been unemployed, but haven't been looking for a job in the last 4 weeks. And so the BLS actually gives us some of those statistics. They'll ask additional questions if you fall into this category of unemployed, right? Or not in the labor force. What are some other people that choose not to be in the labor force? You might have stay-at-home parents. You might have students. You all might find yourself in this category. Maybe you're not working because you're going to school full-time, right? You could also have, you're just independently wealthy and you don't need to work anymore, which is also what we are all trying to get to with retired, right? So retired persons would also be not in the labor force, okay? So when you think about it this way, then we have two statistics, and they're important to remember both of them. So what happens is a lot of the time, everybody focuses on the unemployment rate, right? And the unemployment rate is simply the number of unemployed persons divided by the labor force. But the problem is that if you have a lot of discouraged workers, which tends to happen when you're in a recession, then the unemployment rate is being stated too low. It's not really representing how many people are really truly unemployed, right? So how can we consider this? Well, what we should do is consider not just the unemployment rate by itself, but also the labor force participation rate, okay? And so the labor force participation rate is to take the labor force, I'm going to call that LF, and divide it by the civilian non-institutional population. And because it's a rate, we multiply it by 100 and express it as a percent, right? Now this is going to be a number between 0 and 100, right? Because we can't have a labor force that is bigger than our population, right? And so the same with the unemployment rate, that would be the number of unemployed divided by labor force times 100 to express it as a percent. So when we're thinking about this, if you really start to think about the decision tree, that's what this is generally called, and then think about the rates are always taking this number and dividing it by the one ahead of it, then hopefully that will help you visualize how we're calculating these rates, right? And so we can't just look at the unemployment rate. We really, anytime we look at the unemployment rate, in order to not overlook this group, particularly the discouraged workers group, we want to look at it in conjunction with, well, what's going on with the labor force participation rate, right? Because we might see that the unemployment rate has dropped, but so has the labor force participation rate. If they're both dropping, then that's telling us that simply fewer people are part of the labor force. That's not necessarily good. What do we want to see? Well, what we'd like to see in our economy is an unemployment rate that's dropping while we have a participation rate that's increasing. That means that there are more people being pulled into the labor force who are finding jobs, and that's really a harbinger of economic growth. Hope you found this helpful. I'll see you next time.